Our second reader is a writer, salesman, and family dude living in Chicago. He has written and starred in 5 one-man shows around Chicago, including The Pursuit of Happiness, The Generic News Hour, and Habitat. Please welcome back to Tuesday Funk, David Daskal.
Yeah, that's good. Hi, everybody. Thanks for coming out. Especially thanks to all the Jellyvision people here. Okay, this is the beginning of a longer piece that I've been working on. If it weren't for the problem of concealment, she would have cut herself a lot more than she did. She tried to think of objects more perfect than a razor blade and always had a hard time coming up with something. She imagined the exact edge of the cutting surface, how elegantly thin it must be. How thin? She Googled it. A little less than 1/1000th of an inch. So thin. Deliciously thin. She imagined the exact point of contact where the blade cleaved her skin into 2 sections. The best cuts were the ones that trailed the thinnest line of blood behind the blade. Too little pressure and all you got was skin. Too much pressure and it got messy. Also, the best cuts seemed to be the most painful, like long, slow paper cuts. The deep ones hurt more later, but in the moment, she relished the control required to continue cutting at just the right depth. If it weren't for the problem of concealment, she would have treated her skin as paper and the razor blade as a pen, and she would have doodle-sliced a bunch of parallel lines close together, then a bunch of lines at 90-degree angles to the first lines, then 45 degrees. She wondered how long she could go before her skin began to shred. Not really. She wouldn't do that. She understood the limits and the risks. She was careful. Everything was sterile. Alcohol was involved. But it was interesting to think about. A couple of friends knew, and they would ask her why she did it. And honestly, improbably, she would say it felt good. What she really meant was that it felt good after, as the endorphins flooded her brain and she got that warm, languid feeling as subtle and exquisite as any drug. The feeling that could take the edge off any tension she was feeling. The more tension, the greater the release. It was like slowly letting the air out of a balloon. Once the cut was done, the tension would have all but drained out of her body. But concealment, god damn the concealment. She would rail in her head about why she should have to conceal her stress relief, when the most popular form of other people's stress relief, alcohol, was celebrated. But she was not blind to reality. Cutting herself really bothered people. It involved a kind of violation of the body that alcohol did not. She'd been at a party recently and was talking to a guy she was attracted to. He also made her nervous. He couldn't tell she was nervous, but she was. He was smart, maybe as smart as she was, and she liked his arms. It wasn't conventional, but she loved a guy with a certain type of active, expressive arms. She was leaning up against a wall, staring at him and his arms and watching his lips move. He was close to her, talking. There was some project he was working on, and a play, and Tucson, Arizona was involved. Or maybe this was all about someone else? After about 15 minutes, she said she had to go to the bathroom. She was all knotted up inside. She locked the door and pulled out a blade from her purse, and within a minute had made a quick, precise cut on the inside of her arm, just below her armpit. She put the blade away, stared at herself for a moment in the mirror, and opened the door. He was waiting for her. "What were you doing in there?" he asked, a little bit suspiciously. "Are you serious?" she said. But he caught her in a way. He somehow knew something was up, and for some reason, she wanted to just tell him the truth. She wanted to show him, right there. They continued to talk, and as they did, she realized she'd not made as precise a cut as she normally did. And she could feel a thin drop of blood slowly making its way down her arm. At first, she silently panicked. She stared, not staring. Ideas flicked through her head. She wanted to casually twist her arm and reveal the red streak. She flashed on him, licking the inside of her arm and then kissing her so she could share in the metallic taste of her own blood. She wasn't thinking clearly. It was hazy, but she knew she couldn't go back into the bathroom so soon. She couldn't just wipe off the blood, and she didn't want to move away from this man. So she kept both arms at her sides and looked at him. She looked at him in a way she knew would make him kiss her. She was good at this. It actually wasn't that hard to do. And it came in handy when she was tired of talking and just wanted someone to touch her. She tilted her head just a bit and looked at him just so. As he pulled her in, she wrapped her arms around him and smeared the back of his bicep red. After a minute, she pulled away, backwards, step by step, fighting off his questions, until she turned and left. She headed home annoyed. Cutting was about control, the precision of the whole operation, and she had blown it. In a pressure situation, she had cut a little too deep and been thrown off her game. She had to improvise and kiss a guy she didn't even know in order to get out of there and tend to her arm. 2 mistakes, the cut and the kiss. What the hell had gotten into her? She did smile a bit, though, at the thought of him discovering the blood. He'd look for a cut himself and find none. He'd be confused, and separately, he'd be thinking about her. She didn't give him her number. She didn't even give him her name. But she knew he'd find her eventually. She got home and headed to the bathroom. Cutting herself carried the risk of infection, and infection was potentially dangerous and eventually requiring trips to the doctor. And the doctor would have inevitable questions about how she cut herself. She wanted none of that. She was meticulous in her wound care. She got to her bathroom and poured some hydrogen peroxide on her arm. The edges of the cut sizzled. The first time her mom poured hydrogen peroxide on one of her cuts and the blood started bubbling, she thought it was the coolest thing she had ever seen. Blood sizzling. Why did it do that? Her mom told her. The cells contain an enzyme called catalase. In a cut, there's lots of catalase around. When the catalase came in contact with hydrogen peroxide, it turned the hydrogen peroxide into water and oxygen. Catalase did this extremely efficiently, and the bubbles she saw in the foam were pure oxygen. When her mom first told her this, she was maybe 6 years old and she understood none of it. But she loved the explanation nonetheless, and she would have her mom repeat it to her every time she got a cut. She was convinced that hydrogen peroxide was the reason she became a scientist. As she poured liquid on her wound, she inhaled deeply, convinced she could detect the pure oxygen bubbling beneath. She dabbed the cut with a cotton ball to dry it off and smeared on some ointment, then the Band-Aid. What was once messy and potentially dangerous was now totally under control. The body would heal itself. How many millions of years of evolution had been required to create that trick, she wondered. She put the supplies away, flicked off the light, and left the bathroom. The rituals of cleaning, sterilizing, and covering the injury gave her great satisfaction. And it gave her the added benefit of being able to study blood at close range. Blood fascinated her. She thought it was the purest color that existed in the world. The pearl of blood, oozing slowly, inexorably out of a wound, was profound, like lava oozing out of a volcano. The color saturation of a drop of blood on a tissue was absolute. She wondered why blood was the only fluid with this intensity. Why wasn't there a comparable blue fluid, a comparable green? She decided that it must have something to do with life itself, and that a rainbow of fluids with blood's intensity could only exist in science fiction. This fascination with blood was transgressive, she knew, totally separate from the need to hide her cutting. There was something shameful about blood all by itself. In the same way that it rankled her that she had to keep her cutting secret, she did not understand the secrecy around blood. By nature, blood was hidden, the stuff underneath the skin that makes life possible. But blood on the outside of the body was a no-no. Its appearance under nearly all circumstances brought normal discourse to a screaming halt until it was under control. She thought that this was part of the hysteria around menstruation, the euphemisms, the embarrassment. Obviously, some of this had to do with where the blood came from, and some had to do with its connection to sex, and some with the general stupidity of men. But she was convinced that part of the hysteria was specifically blood-related, the shame of bleeding, of being unable to control the very fluid of life, of requiring absorbents to secretly soak up the excess. God forbid someone should know, but she was fascinated. She'd sit in the toilet and watch the clear water slowly turn pink as each new drop hit the bowl. It was the next day, and a text came in to her phone from an unknown number. It read, "Did you know you were bleeding when you left the party?" First, she couldn't believe he'd already gotten her number. Second, she couldn't believe he'd already figured out she was bleeding. She found this a tiny bit thrilling. "Who is this?" she texted back, knowing full well the answer. "You know who it is. You were bleeding." "No, I wasn't." "I'm pretty sure you were. You got blood on my arm when you kissed me." She paused before she answered. Sometimes she just liked to make people wait. Finally, she typed, "I have no idea how blood got on your arm." He typed simply, "No?" She loved this. He wasn't dumb. He knew what had happened. He was challenging her. This back and forth, it was fun. "I don't even know your name. How could I get blood on you if I don't even know your name?" "Evan," he typed. She responded, "I thought it was Devin." She knew it was Evan. She called her friend who hosted the party and gotten the full report. But something in her had to make him work harder. Then a pause, and then he typed, "I want to see you." This, she recognized immediately, was real. It was honest. It was direct. He really did want to see her. It was too soon for this. She didn't like it, and to her, it meant the conversation was over. Later, she pressed send. Later? Try next week. "What are you doing right now?" he typed. A last-ditch flare she'd seen his before. "What am I doing?" she responded. "What are you wearing?" If this was talking on the phone, it would have been rude and bold. She might have not known if he was joking or serious. But as a text message, as type, it just looked stupid and desperate. So she let it hang there, unanswered, and didn't bother to respond. She lied on her bed and stared at the ceiling, thinking nothing, lying motionless. The ceiling was white stucco, with vague lines and swirls. Abstract, something and nothing. Her walls were decorated with abstract art posters, Mondrian, Malevich, Rothko. These were objects. Then there were objects on shelves, glass, scientific, possibly antique. She loved the shapes and the texture of old glass, from a time when science was utterly analog, no hard drives, all data kept on stacks of neatly lined graph paper. The intersection of art and science fascinated her, and even in middle school, she would submit lab reports with photos or images from the art world. At first, the images were obvious. Edward Muybridge photos of animals in motion, or the Gross Clinic by Thomas Eakins, art from science. Then later, even art from math. She would stare at the cover of her old calculus textbook, with the curved line and shaded area underneath. This area beneath the line could be determined exactly. There was an actual equation for it, and this equation created a beautiful book cover. She imagined that there was an equation out there, somewhere, undiscovered, that could explain everything. The past, the future, the actions of every person in every lifetime. The reason for the dust bunny under her bed and her mother's restless dissatisfaction. The reason for chocolate and the reason she continued to cut herself. She imagined this equation, written out freehand, analog, on a dusty chalkboard, the most beautiful work of art ever created. Thank you.